Well, good morning. It is great to be with you. I'm having some flashbacks here this morning. Daryl Peters and I were youth pastors together in State College 23 years ago. And when he saw me this morning, he quickly reminded me we both have a few more gray hairs than we did 23 years ago. Also, Mark Zeisloft, who's on your staff, he and I were college students for the same 4 years together at Penn State, and really just didn't know that Penn State would be turning out so many pastors. Wanted to introduce you to my family. My wife Beth and I have been married for almost 29 years. We have 6 children who range in age right now from 27 down to 9 years old. 3 of those are biological. 3 of them have been adopted through the foster care system. We've fostered 28 children in the last 15 years. And it's just a little bit of our story. And I always like to say the names of our children. This is Kara, Katie, Carly, Kaylin, Callie, and Caden. And we never get it right. And I love this picture because we look great. But you should see us trying to get out of the house in the morning. We're like a glorious mess most of the time. But that's our story. And I want to do a lot of storytelling really this morning for a handful of different reasons. A lot of it's going to have to do with vulnerable children, God's heart for caring for orphans, but there's going to also be some faith stuff tied into that. And I know that a lot of us show up every week with probably have heard a whisper from God somewhere in your story. And I want to just maybe dump a little bit of gasoline on whatever that whisper is this morning and encourage you to take whatever step of faith it is that God has you to take next. One of the first things that we ask children as they begin to be able to talk is, how big are you? And what do they usually say? So big. Good. You guys do that in Lebanon County as well. Yeah, we throw our arms up and want our kids to realize that they're getting big, they're strong, they're not weak or easily intimidated. We serve a great big God, and one of the things I want to make sure that we do this morning is make sure that our perspective of God is in the right place. That we have stories to tell about a great big God so that as we tell his stories, we acknowledge that he is a great big God. I don't have this on the screen, but in John 14, Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it." You can ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. I just love that Jesus says we can do greater things than he if we ask in his name. And I've found that when our stories align with his heart, God wants to show up in some pretty big ways. And I'm going to guess that most of you believe that verse in its entirety as I read it this morning. And I love what Mark Batterson says is that one of the greatest tragedies is the prayers that go unanswered because they go unasked. What is it that we aren't asking God for, that we need to be, so that we can declare our great big God? I have a degree in animal science from Penn State University. I'm a cowboy. I never wanted to get into ministry. But I want to tell you a little bit about that story and how God has brought me from that cowboy to being the director at Keystone Family Alliance. I was working as a herdsman for Kinsley. Maybe you've seen some of his trucks around here. I was a herdsman for his farm in southern York County. We had 600 head of Black Angus cattle. I loved what I was doing. I had a 4-wheel drive truck, a rent-free house, beef in the freezer, a good salary. But God was doing some things. He was starting to whisper in my heart a desire to serve vulnerable children. And so as I started to think about that, I would talk to my wife often, and I just told her, like, hey, we need to start a children's ranch and put kids and cows together. And I thought, I'm going to start a company, make a lot of money, buy this ranch, and start this ministry. And my wife looked at me and like, that is not even you. There's no way that's happening. So we agreed that maybe we better pray together. So we decided we were going to pray for 30 days. And on April 1st of 1997, we were going to make a decision about what the next chapter of our story would look like. And so we prayed. And on April 1st, I woke up and my wife said to me, Vince, why don't you think about becoming a youth pastor? Like, no way. I went to work that day, and then I came home. My mom called me, and she said, Vince, why don't you think about becoming a youth pastor? And the two of them had not talked. A couple hours later that day, I talked to my best friend from high school I hadn't talked to for quite a long time, and he said he learned a little bit about what was going on in our story, and he said, hey, Vince, you'll never believe this, but the youth pastor at our church just resigned, and the church wants to hire somebody that doesn't have a Bible college degree. I'm a little slow. But on April 1st, 1997, God answered our prayers in very unexpected ways. But we said, okay. And we landed in Iowa at a church where I started as a youth pastor. And fast forward a couple of years, I ended up back in State College at the church that I attended as a college student. Eventually ended up becoming the lead pastor. And again, please remember, I'm an animal science guy. I don't know how to do this stuff. But I was asked eventually to be the lead pastor there, and the church was 50 years old at the time, and no adult had ever gone on a mission trip. And I knew that we needed to be a part of helping rewrite that story. They believed that we should go, and they all thought it was a good idea, but I couldn't get anybody to kind of take those next steps. So I was convicted that if it was going to happen, I was going to have to be the one to lead that. And I started to pray. Again, prayer is a key ingredient here. Within a week of praying, God, show me what that looks like, I got an invitation to go to Zambia to help start a piggery. So now God's using the animal science degree as a pastor to start a piggery to serve vulnerable children in Africa. And when my wife and I were in Zambia, we met a ton of orphans for the first time. 10% of the population at the time was orphaned because of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. God started to wreck our hearts for the things that wreck his. And when we came back, I had the opportunity to begin to share the story with my small church in State College. And that summer, through a day camp, 40 children raised $800 that we sent over to my friend in Zambia who sponsored 3 children in an existing orphan school. But then my friend sends me 15 profiles of orphans who are not going to school, who are not eating meals every day, who are sleeping on the ground. And I'm able to share those 15 profiles with my small congregation, and almost immediately the individuals in the church began to sponsor those children. My friend sends me another 15 profiles, and before I know it, our church of about 100 people is sponsoring 46 children in Zambia. And he emails me and says, hey, Vince, we're going to start a school that we're going to call State College Christian Church School for the Orphans. And while we were flattered, we thought probably not a great name for a school in Zambia. So we'd asked them to rename it, and so they did. And they called it Haven of Hope. And Haven of Hope has since grown to 2 schools in Zambia and 1 in Uganda, with more than 350 children being sponsored. And we're seeing those children now graduating from college and serving as pastors and nurses, and they're just serving their community in so many ways. And I tell that story because what it did to the heart of our small congregation is it rewrote our story, and it rewrote the story of hundreds of children in Africa. I found that it wasn't that the people in my church didn't care. It's just that they didn't know what the needs were, and they didn't know how to take a practical next step. And as soon as we laid that out, I had the privilege of watching a small church just kind of change. And over the next 3 years, 30% of those adults had gone on a mission trip to Africa. At the same time as we were starting that ministry there, I'm meeting with 12 other pastors in State College on a weekly basis. We were praying together every week. And a couple of those pastors started to say, what if we actually did something to serve our community together? So I was able to say to them, what if we started an orphan care ministry? Those pastors agreed immediately, said, yes, let's do that. So I asked them if they could find a representative from their church who already had a heartbeat for foster care, adoption, and orphan care that was willing to get together with the other representatives in our community. And those pastors found somebody, and we began to meet, and within a couple of months, we officially became the Center County Orphan Care Alliance. I got on an elevator shortly after that with one of the directors at Children and Youth Services, and I said to her, as a church in the county, how can we serve your agency? And she looked at me and said, you're the church, you'll do one event and we won't hear from you again. I thought, ouch. We need to rewrite that story. Thankfully, within the next year and a half, the churches in the county had become the #1 recruiter of foster and adoptive homes for the county. Within 3 years, they looked at us and they said, you guys are not going away. Can we have a seat at the table? And now, more than a decade later, we're thankful that CYS is still in the room, and we have a great relationship with them on so many levels that has rewritten the story in Center County. But I want to back up again to a little bit of the story in Africa. After that first trip, within 6 months or so, my friend in Zambia, who was a pastor, emailed and he said, Vince, will you come over and train some pastors in Zambia? And I said something to him like, you realize I have a degree in animal science. I don't train pastors. And he's like, hey, we can teach some leadership principles. And for me, I was like, okay, perhaps God can do something through that. At the time, he was working with about 32 pastors. And so when I emailed him back to say, what are you thinking? How many pastors will be a part of this training? And what do you want the theme of that training to be? He emails me back and he says, there's going to be 500 pastors. And we want the theme to be Nehemiah 2:17, a time to rebuild. Because the nation had been crushed and they need to rebuild after the HIV and AIDS pandemic. So again, I'm like, you got the wrong guy. But perhaps God can do something. So I had just finished reading a book called Visioneering, written by Andy Stanley. It was based on the book of Nehemiah. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to email him and his ministry and say, hey, we're getting ready to do this training in Zambia. Is there any way that you could give us a great deal on 500 of your books? And they emailed back and said, hey, we don't normally do this, but we're going to drop ship 500 books that you can take and give away to the pastors. Then I had another friend who was an author and a speaker an author of the book, The Burning Heart Contract. And she learned that we were going to Africa, and she said, hey, Vince, I'm going to give you 100 copies of the book so that you can use them as you see fit in Zambia. And when we get to Zambia, it turns out that there were 600 pastors that showed up to those 2 trainings in 2 different cities. God had provided enough books to be able to meet those needs, and we were able to distribute these. We did some training for a couple of days. But within a couple of years, I was back in Zambia with my wife on the streets, and this guy comes running up to me and says, Pastor Vince, you won't remember me. But I was at Mpika at the pastor's training that was 8 hours away from where we were that day. And he said, you'll never believe what God has been doing in the villages and the communities where we live. Before that training, our churches were in competition with one another. But that training brought us together, and we're serving the community together. And God has used that book as a text to be able to help us equip the people in our congregations. And I look at stories like that and I say, only God. Only God would use people who are trained in the wrong field, don't have the right resources to be able to accomplish stuff. But he wants to find people who have just enough faith to believe that he can do more than we can ask or imagine. In Center County, we were doing an awesome job of recruiting foster and adoptive families. But about 3 years in, we realized that they were dropping out just about as fast as we were recruiting them. We realized that we needed to do a better job of supporting the families that we were recruiting. So one of the things that we had started at the time was an email list that we called our James 127 email list. And essentially that was just, if you gave us your email address, we would email you anytime one of the local social workers had a need. And they started sending us needs like they needed cribs and diapers and clothing, beds. One of my favorite uses of that email list was a biological mom who was trying to get her son back, but she needed a new friend group. So the agency wanted to know if there was a church in her neighborhood that would wrap around her. And we were able to find mentors for that mom, and she got her son back, and the two of them are still able to be a part of that church community today. So we started to see God use that. And then fast forward a handful more years later, and we learned about a ministry in Georgia called Promise 686 that has what is called wraparound support, engineered care communities that wrap around foster families. We said, we need to do that here. So I'm going to back up just a little bit again. I'm going to give you some stats right here in Pennsylvania today. In the state of Pennsylvania, there's 14,000 children in foster care. There's nearly 3,000 children whose parental rights have already been terminated. They are sitting on a waiting list, waiting to be adopted. Most of them will wait 5 to 7 years before they find a forever family. But 1,100 of them will age out of the system this year with no forever family. And when they age out, we know that 80% of those boys are going to be in jail within 2 years. 70% of those girls are going to be pregnant and single before their 21st birthday. That's not to mention the number of those kids that will end up sex trafficked, living below the poverty line, homeless. The outcomes are not great for them. But at Keystone Family Alliance, we look at those numbers and we say, we don't think that's okay, especially when there's nearly 14,000 churches in the state of Pennsylvania, all with a biblical mandate to look after orphans and vulnerable children. And if the church gets this right, we get to make God famous. And what we have found as we've gone around the state of Pennsylvania and started to tell the stories of the needs of the vulnerable, it's not that the church doesn't care. It's just that they haven't known the needs and they didn't know how to take a practical next step. So almost 3 years ago, God started to stir in my heart again to say it was time to take what we were doing in Center County to the other 66 counties in the state. My wife looked at me and she said, "What? We loved the church that I was pastoring. We were very comfortable." And she's like, "You're going to go out and have to do some fundraising and kind of start all over again." But she was like, "Okay." And today, I'm thrilled to tell you that actually in the last 3 weeks or so, we're now officially in 16 counties with county coordinators like Matt and Amy and doing what they're doing, and hundreds of churches that are partnering together that have started to take some very deliberate next steps and will be speaking up today on Stand Sunday, Orphan Sunday, to be the voice of vulnerable children and families. And we believe that together with churches like yours, and I love hearing the stories that I've heard about how many of you are already engaged. You guys get it around here. But when we can step out of our comfort zones and into this space of serving the vulnerable, we're doing what God has asked us to do. And we put our faith on display, not just by word, but by our deeds. And it matters. 3 years ago, we started to ask the question, what if? So this is our vision at Keystone Family Alliance. We're just saying, what if we could be a catalyst to recruit at least 3 foster families in all 500 Pennsylvania school districts that are willing to take sibling groups and children over the age of 8 years old. There is almost no school district in the state that's willing to take that, where there's families waiting to take that demographic of children. So we're saying, church, what if we could be the answer to that? The second question that we started to ask is, what if we could find a care community that is willing to wrap around every one of those foster families before they say yes? So I'm going to pause and I'm going to talk about care communities a minute. Care communities are a group of at least 5 people who say, we're willing to wrap around a single foster family. And when you volunteer, you're saying you're willing to take a meal one time per month to that family. So that foster family is now getting a meal delivered to their home every week. As a volunteer, maybe you'll also be willing to help with childcare or transportation or laundry or lawn work. Or one foster 22-year-old guy, college student right now who's serving on a care community, started to offer guitar lessons to a kid in his care community, and it relieves that foster parent for a couple of hours every week so that she can actually get some things done. But what we found is that if we can get a care community wrapped around a foster family, let me back up again. 50% of foster families will quit before they reach the first year. 90% are going to quit before they reach the second year. It's hard work to invite kids from hard places into your home. But if we can get a care community wrapped around them, 90% of those families will still be fostering beyond 2 years. Our motto is everyone can do something. Not everyone can foster or adopt, but everyone can do something to serve on a team, and it makes a big difference. August 31st, we get a phone call. My wife does, from CYS. Those 3 letters pop up on her phone, CYS. She knows if she answers it, our life is about to change. And sure enough, she answered the phone, and right now we're still licensed as a foster family, but we are not a long-term option any longer. We had to learn the difference between our load and our limit a handful of years ago. But we'll still say yes to some children as long as the county can find a long-term option for these kids, and we'll be a temporary spot for these kids to land. So when they called us, we're only signed up to take 1. But they said, hey, would you be willing to take 2 elementary age kids, because we don't have any other homes right now in your school districts that are willing to take siblings. Well, while she was talking then, she actually learned that there was a sibling group of 3, and they were just going to break them up. They were going to put the 4-year-old in one foster home and 2 elementary age. They were asking if we'd be willing to take them. But my wife learned that there was 3, and she said, no, send them all. We didn't want to be able to break those kids up. And so those 3 kids show up at our house on August 31st in the evening, and when they show up, they don't have the right clothes or enough clothes to be able to wear to school tomorrow. We had to start to learn what appointments they had to go to, and they have to visit their biological parents. We have to have CYS caseworkers in the house. There was doctor's appointments and therapy appointments that these kids had to get to. And while we're trying to figure all of this out with the other 3 children under our roof, they have our last name, it's just absolute chaos. And so when somebody shows up with a meal from our care community, my wife is like, praise Jesus. We can make it through the night. And the next day when somebody shows up and says, how can we help transport these kids to the appointments they need to get to? We can make it through the day. I had to go out of town for a week, and our care community has stepped into that space. And they said, hey, can we pick the kids up after school and we'll bring them back after dinner? Or we'll take them to an appointment. How can we make sure you have meals all week while Vince is out of town? I just share that because we have just found that those care communities have been a lifesaver for our family. And I talk to so many people that say, I wish that we could foster or adopt, but they're just not in a space to be able to do that. These care communities are a way that you can make an incredible difference. Back to the what ifs. The third what if that we started to say was, what if there would be at least 550 people in all 67 Pennsylvania counties willing to volunteer through Gateway. And Gateway is an online portal that used to be our James 1:27 email list. We had built out for the state of Pennsylvania so that as a volunteer, if you go register through Gateway, you're just saying you're willing to receive an email anytime a social worker in Lebanon County has a need. And they'll place that need on Gateway. You'll get an email one time, no more than one time per day. And just over the last 2 weeks, we've seen social workers across the state place more than 25 needs in 8 or 9 different counties. And we're seeing the body of Christ step up and meet those tangible needs. So this is kind of one of these low-hanging fruit, kind of easy, everybody can do it. Right now in Lebanon County, there are 68 volunteers that have registered for Gateway. Matt and I got connected, I don't know, it was back in May. I think I got a call from Matt, and Matt's like, hey, I don't know you, but I heard about the work that you're doing. Matt and Amy had started a nonprofit that was going to do very similar to the work that we're doing. And he said, why on earth would I try to reinvent the wheel or do this separately? And he said, can I be part of your staff? And I was like, I don't even know, I'm thinking to myself, I don't know who this guy is yet. But I'm so thankful that God brought our stories together. They're crazy people adopting 9 kids. But I love what God does with those stories. And I thought that those are our kind of people. And we're so thankful for the heart that they have for Lebanon County children. And so since June, when we officially launched in Lebanon, there's now 68 people registered for Gateway. And our hope is that today, you'll follow that QR code on the screen. We want to hit that 550 number so that there's so many Jesus followers in your county ready to meet tangible needs. Anytime social workers have them, a Jesus follower is going to step into that place, that space. And often that'll connect you with a foster family or a biological family trying to keep their kids, or a social worker. And while you meet tangible needs, sometimes then those life-on-life connections will take you to a deeper level of relationship where we can have the opportunity to share the love and the hope of Jesus. And the final part of our what if is we just started to say, what if in all 67 counties, there could be at least 39 churches working together on this issue? We think we can rewrite the story for Pennsylvania's children and families. Maybe you've heard the story of a draft horse where one horse hooked to a load can pull 8,000 pounds. But if you hook 2 of them together, it doesn't double, it triples to 24,000 pounds that they can pull. But if you actually train those 2 horses together, it quadruples to 32,000 pounds. And that's our hope, is that we can get the church of Pennsylvania, the Church of Lebanon County, in the room together so that we can be better together, so that we can bring the kingdom of God from up there down here. James 1:27 tells us that pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their misfortune, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. This verse is describing something that is pure and undefiled in its application and its expression. Jason Johnson with the Christian Alliance for Orphans wrote the following. He said, an interesting fact that the Greek word for pure is translated as catharsis, in English meaning cleansing. This is the root from which our word cathartic is derived. This refers to an activity or a practice which is psychologically or emotionally relieving or cleansing for us. It's also the same root we get our word catheter from, a tube that's inserted into the body to drain toxic and potentially dangerous fluids. So there's something pure and cleansing about what James is describing here. It was Martin Luther who once said, the world does not need a definition of religion as much as it needs a demonstration. That's pretty much the idea here. The context of the whole book of James is a clear call to put our faith in the gospel into action. It's an outward expression of the gospel, which is the cleanest, purest, and most vivid that we could participate in. And participating in it somehow cleanses us. The kind of people who have been deeply affected by the gospel within them begin to express it outwardly in some pure and vivid and clear ways through serving others. One of the purest and most undefiled demonstrations of the Gospels is to care for, to give intense attention to, and to go see. A handful of months ago, I was out in our pasture with 3 of our children, and the road next to our pasture, there was these 3 girls on an ATV flying up the road, and they were just having a great old time. But at the end of that road was a pretty hard curve if they were going to stay on the road. And as I watched them, I'm like, this is not going to end well. And sure enough, as they came around that hard curve, they flipped the machine, and the 3 of them ended up bloodied and broken up on the ground. I ended up calling my wife really quick and said, go get the neighbor who's a fire company guy and get him over. She hears screaming in the background. She's not sure if it's our children or what's going on. Called 911, but eventually my wife came running out to the road, and she sees a 10-year-old that's laying on the ground, bloodied and kind of broken up with her arms. And my wife just goes to her and puts this little girl's head in her lap. And the thing you have to know about my wife is she can't stand blood, or this is not her. She won't even take a splinter out of my finger. But in the moment, she was moved with compassion to walk into the space of someone who needed to be cared for. See, the tense of this word calls for this to be a habitual practice, an attitude, not just an isolated act. It's about who we are consistently. It actually conveys far more than just stopping by and saying hello, but it implies a sense of consistent closeness and nearness and personal contact. It's what happens through foster care and adoption. Those who foster and adopt, I say, are full-time responders. We aren't just first responders. We're there when the kids are throwing up in the middle of the night, or when the diapers need changed, and when our kids from hard places have to have medical procedures. And it's a consistent closeness, nearness, and personal contact. Jesus came near. He wrapped himself up in our brokenness, and he was broken by our brokenness so that we didn't have to be broken any longer. And in the gospel, God says, I see you where you are, and I'm coming after you. Perhaps James is suggesting that the gospel is most purely put on display when we do the same thing with our lives to those around us. And when we do that, when we step towards the hard and the broken and not away, it puts the heart of God demonstrated in the gospel on display with clarity and purity and cleanliness unlike anything else. That's our hope for the church in Pennsylvania. That we are a people that have been so dramatically affected by what Jesus did in our brokenness, that we will walk into, we will stay close and be near to the least of these. And when we do that collectively, my service makes a ripple. Together, we begin to create a wave. But we get the Church of Pennsylvania working together. Believe we will create a tsunami for good that will bring up there, down here. So we just want to ask, what does that look like for you? Not everyone can or should foster or adopt, but everyone can do something. So as an invitation to some practical next steps, we want to encourage you to consider becoming one of what we hope will actually be thousands of people in Lebanon County that register for Gateway, willing to receive an email anytime there's a need by one of your social workers. Maybe you can serve on a care community. Be one of those people who wraps around a foster family who has said yes to that full-time commitment, and you can be the person that helps hold their arms up, and you can see Kim and be a part of what's already happening as a movement here to support those families who are answering that call, because it matters. Maybe you can consider fostering or adopting. We'd love to talk to you more about how to get connected to a local agency that'll help you through that process here in Lebanon County. I don't know what it is for you, but I do know that we serve a great big God. One that says he wants to do greater things through us than he was able to do himself. Because when we're willing to take the risk and pray prayers that align with his heart, he will do far more than we can ever ask or imagine. And the world needs you to show up. You may be the wrong person, educated in the wrong field, just like I was. But with just enough faith and taking the next step, and I say tiptoe if you must, but take the step, because that small step might end up being the biggest step of your life. And by doing so, you may very well save a child or a church or a community or a nation or a world. Will you pray with me? Jesus, thank you for coming from heaven to earth, to get up close to my brokenness, to take it on yourself so that I don't have to be broken any longer. God, I have no idea what it is you're stirring in the hearts of your people in this room this morning. But I pray that whatever it is you're whispering through your Holy Spirit to them right now, they won't hesitate, but they will obey. They'll take this, they'll tiptoe, they'll take the next step, they'll do whatever they need to. God, give them the courage to do whatever it is you're calling them to do this morning. And we look forward to being able to throw our hands up and say, look at my great big God. We ask that your kingdom would come on earth as it is in heaven. In Jesus' name, amen.